Thank you so much for letting me know that.
Okay. Hello, everyone. It's Edwin Rutsch, Director of the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy, and I'm here with Ashok Bhattacharya. Is that, if you want to pronounce the name? Sorry if I
That's a
messed it
really
up.
that's a really good effort, Edwin. It's actually Ashok Bhattacharya, so it's quite phonetic. But Edwin, if you go to India, they won't understand that. It's Ashok Bhattacharya, and that I'm just not going to go with that in North America. So I just go with Ashok, and you can use that for the rest of the interview, and we'll be fine.
Okay, great. Well, let me give a little bit of a background about you. You're a psychiatrist and the founder of the Empathy Clinic, which is why we're talking. I try to talk with everyone that's interested in empathy, and your website is empathyclinic.com, so anyone can go right there and check that out. And you're located in Ontario, Canada. And here I was just looking at the description of the clinic, which is really makes my heart sing. This your description. The clinic, Empathy Clinic, is committed to teaching, practice, and enhancement of empathy. Empathy is the starting point for compassion and what we do when we care about each other. Appreciating the experience of another person is a capacity and skill, whether it is in a relationship, family, friends, or at the workplace. All work better and smoother with empathy when empathy is being practiced. So we want to kind of, do you want to say more by way of just introduction?
Yeah, well, I've been a psychiatrist for about over 3 decades. And the reason why I'm interested in empathy is largely because it's not really a huge part of practice in psychiatric diagnosis and treatment. And I realized this years ago, much to my dismay. And I'm not saying that psychiatrists aren't interested in the word, but if I talk about empathy to my colleagues, I often try to offer an empathy course at some of my professional organizations, and I usually get laughter. And one of the reasons I get laughter is my colleagues think that empathy is unteachable. And I personally think that might be wrong. I think empathy might definitely be teachable to people who are receptive, and may even be teachable to people who are not so receptive. And I'm talking about people in the narcissistic spectrum of personalities. And I know this because I've done it. Mm-hmm. And I think if we look at empathy as a capacity, that about 80% of the people who of the population has a pretty robust capacity for empathy. That's a good A. That's out of 100. But that means there's 20% of people who may not have such a good capacity. But I'd really like to talk about a definition of empathy if we can get that conversation going.
Oh, great. Yeah, that's what I had wanted to talk about. So what I'm hearing is, you, as a psychiatrist, you're sort of giving the context that in psychiatry, empathy is not really valued. It's not highly valued. And that so even they're saying, hey, empathy is not teachable. Maybe that's one thought there. And I'm hearing that you feel that it is teachable. And I will second that, because I have talked to psychiatrists and they will say that too. There's no real training for empathy within psychiatry, even though you think it'd be found fundamental to it. So I did want to say, before we start, that there's, if people can check out your website, find out more about your empathy work. There's also a great interview, which is how I found out about you, from Anita Novak. She interviewed you and really got a lot of sort of your background, as well as you have a video called "Is Empathy is Teachable?" So you're making the case. And what we wanted to really kind of dig into here was sort of the definition of empathy. Like, what are we talking about, when we talk about empathy? Because I'm finding that there's sort of I'm wanting to create an empathy movement, right? Or have been working for 14 years, whatever, working. How do we create this movement? And I keep coming against this issue of unclear definitions that I find is really inhibiting a movement. So I'm really wanting to do a deep dive. I saw your interview and I thought, oh, I love talking with clinicians, because they have experience. It's just not theoretical. You're talking from your real experience of working with empathy. So I thought you'd be a good person to talk to about how you see, the definition of empathy.
Well, what I first normally do when I talk to people about empathy is I get them to tell me their definition, but I won't put you through that, Edwin, because I think you're asking me. So I'll be as clear as I can think. My biggest disagreement with people who, and these are people who are teaching about empathy sometimes, or you'll see this written in books, is that empathy is the capacity to experience somebody in their shoes. So if you put yourself in somebody else's shoes, you're being empathic. That is not empathy. At the very best, that is sympathy. Sympathy is the capacity to share emotions. And this would be at a wedding when everyone is laughing and crying and joyous, or at a funeral when everyone is crying and people are all feeling simpatico. They're feeling the same feeling. And there's generally an agreement that everyone is feeling the same thing. The same thing happens in comedy clubs when someone is making a joke and everyone's laughing. And if you notice, people look around to validate that they're having the right emotion to the joke and that someone isn't laughing inappropriately, which can be very socially embarrassing. Now, for me, what therefore, if that's sympathy, what is empathy? And the most unpopular thing I say that empathy is, it requires a capacity to self-negate, which means you actually have to get yourself out of the way to begin to empathize with somebody else's experience from their point of view, not yours. So if someone's telling me something, let's make it simple. Let's say they say, I feel cold in here and I'm feeling kind of warm and I'm thinking about turning on the air conditioning. And I'm thinking, well, they can't possibly be cold because I'm not. I have failed to empathize with them. If I think, well, from that person's point of view, they don't have a lot of warm clothing on. It is sort of a bit cool in here, possibly. I am seeing my air in my breath in the air, so maybe it's quite nippy. Maybe they are feeling cold. And let me try and imagine what they're experiencing from the way they're experiencing it. Get me out of the way. And the more I do that and dive deeper and deeper into that person's experience of themselves in that moment, I'm actually beginning to empathize. And I think
I reflect, I'm going to maybe periodically, I'll pause here to
please,
just reflect
please,
what I'm understanding, as well as
please.
sort of throw in some, of my perspective. So we have sort of this empathic dialogue. So I'm hearing you're saying that there's people often confuse the standing in someone else's shoes as sympathy, which is you have a feeling and they have a feeling, and it's sort of this matched feeling that you have. Sort of, and then you're saying that's not empathy, that's sympathy, and that empathy is sort of sensing what the other person is experiencing and feeling. Did I get that, or correct me if I didn't quite hear that?
You got that, Edwin, you got that perfectly. So just to be even more confusing, if two people happen to be feeling the same thing and they're empathizing with each other, they can be experiencing empathy and sympathy at the same time. The only time it breaks down is if someone is saying to somebody else, I know exactly what you're feeling because I went through the same thing last week, and they think they're empathizing. They actually may not be. In fact, what they might be doing is alienating that person from telling them how they experienced it, because they may be experiencing differently than the way this person's telling that they had this same thing and that's how they felt. And so they might be very scared to discuss that with the other person or reveal it, because now their feeling has not been validated.
And
so
let me say that's sometimes called identification, right? It's like you, instead of just listening to a person, sensing where they are, hearing them, you're saying, oh, I've had that experience. You sort of disconnect from them and you go into your own mind, remembering your own experience. So you're no longer sort of present with them. I
think that's also a very, very astute thing to say, Edwin. I think the other way to put that as well, if someone is telling me something, I might say, wow, something very similar happened to me like that a week ago, but how did your experience feel to you?
Okay, so you bring it back to attention.
Bring it back to the unique experience that they had. So I'm a musician. So something I'm fascinated is something called musical empathy, which happens when musicians start playing together regularly and they just know where each other's going to go next. They know where the drummer's going to go. They know where the bass player's going to go. And when they play more and more regularly, they can become a smooth team. just like it happens in sports when they work together. They begin to anticipate each other. And that I call that directional empathy that can happen in music and also in sports. But it goes once again to the idea of where am I going, as opposed to where's that person going? And if each member is following where the other person is going, whether we're talking about direction or music or emotions or thought, different types of empathy, then they can follow each other. And I don't want to snow you with examples, but the one example I have of this that fascinates me is that big ball of birds that we see in the fall of the year, and they're practicing flying south.
Right.
And there's a big ball, and remember, this is a sphere. It's not just a circle. It's a sphere of birds. It's deep with birds, and they don't bang into each other. How do they know that? And they're dealing with 3 dimensions, left, right, up, and down. You can imagine 1,000 people in a ball not banging into each other if they all had to go in the same direction in a moment's notice. And so birds have incredible directional empathy. They're able to sense where each other is able to go. How they do it, I don't know. To me, that's magic.
Well, you're kind of associating that with musicians. Musicians become very attuned to each other. They become very sensitive to each other. So the moment-to-moment flow, and they're able to relate to what's happening in the other person. And it's not only one directional, it's mutual, right? They're mutually attuned to each other, just like those birds. It's not like one bird following all the other birds. It's like they're all attuned to each other. So there's sort of this sort of relational aspect there.
Exactly what I'm trying to say. And if you only think about yourself, the direction you're going in, you're going to be not only messing up yourself, you're going to be messing up the team. And human beings are essentially a team player. We live in groups, we live in tribes, we live in communities, we live in families. We're constantly in the vicinity of each other. And this is why empathy is so relevant and important, especially if you want to be a functioning and compassionate member of that team. So I have one more example of my definition of empathy. If you can just sort of bore the audience with one more.
No, more definitions, the better. Yeah, I'm all for it.
And that is the sound of our voice. So I'm listening to you, Edwin, to speak, and you have a lovely voice. I'm hearing your voice. But when we listen back on the recording, you may think, yes, that's my voice sounds pleasant, but that's not the way it sounds to me when I'm speaking. And that's because when we speak, our voice is being carried through air, but it's also being carried through our body. In fact, if you put your fingers in your ear, you can still hear your voice quite clearly because you've removed your voice coming through air and it's just going through your body. Empathy is trying to hear the way somebody's voice sounds to them, not the way it sounds to you. And that's impossible. But when you're actually trying to do that, you're actually empathizing with somebody else.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's the thing, the point about not stepping into someone else's shoes. You're trying to hear them, what their point of view is, not
exactly
from
right.
Internally. And yeah, so yeah, let's see. There's one thing that came up is in terms of the definitions. What I find is that the definitions are often posed from an individualistic point of view. That you're seen as an individual, whether you're empathizing or not. And something I sort of noticed in your website is that you're also looking at the relational sort of empathy, like in couples, right? It's not just this individual, you're empathizing or not in the world. There's actually a relationship going on, and that part is usually sort of left out in general, especially the academic sort of definitions. It's very individualistically formulated, it seems to me.
Well, we call that a one-person psychology, and I'm a big fan of 2 or more person psychologies because I think human beings are so intimately connected to each other. So if I'm working with a husband or a wife in my office as an individual, if I'm successful, I'm going to be affecting their relationship at home, even if one of them never comes in to meet me, and their children if they have children, and their friends and family. Because you can't cut one fiber of a spider web and not affect the shape of the web. The whole thing is going to shift a little bit. And I did write a book called A Guide to Reciprocal Empathy for Couples in 2006. So I'm totally oriented towards empathy being at least a 2-person psychology and more, because I think that that's how we're designed. We're designed to be aware of each other.
Yeah, it seems like it's more realistic that and that's how come, I call my center the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy, because I see the relational aspect of empathy, that if we're here together, I'm sensing into who you are, I see your enthusiasm, I see your smile, and likewise, you see my hand waving. And it's not just me, it's not just me being empathic, but we're in sort of this relationship because we're seeing each other, and we're sort of like empathizing with our empathy, each other's empathy and the sensitivity to it. And I started a project on defining empathy. It's actually a website called definingempathy.com. So you can always check that out.
I love that. I love that.
And so when I sort of evaluate definitions, I can see if they're coming from an individualistic point of view or if they have a sense of the relationship. And what I want to do is define empathy within what I call the empathy circle, which is 4 people in a circle empathically dialoguing with each other using active listening. And then where is the empathy within that relationship? Because it's not only 2 people relating to each other, but there's also often observers who are empathizing with the couple. Like you're actually empathizing with the couple when you're doing, within the therapeutic context. There's actually an observer too. So the empathy is more of a multi-dimensional relating. And, can we define empathy and look at name the different components of what's happening instead of it being this sort of detached academic definitions that.
Well, I actually have an example in my book, Cake, and it's a couple exercise, and it's a directional couple exercise. When I talk about directional empathy, I mean it more in the abstract in human relationships, in the sense that maybe a couple get married and then one of them gets a job out of town, and are they going to follow? Are they going to keep their? And they have all these directional issues that they have to decide in order to have a smooth relationship. So the game is called the beanbag game. And you take 2 couples standing on the 4 corners of a ping pong table. And remove the ping pong table. You don't need the table. You just need those distances. Each couple ties themselves together with a piece of wool, a piece of rope that you would make a parcel with to take to the post office. And so you've got one team against another team. They're tied with the string. So phase 1 is 1 beanbag. So this person throws a beanbag and this couple has to catch it. And then they throw it back and forth. The goal is to not break your knot, not break the string between the 2 of them. And as the game progresses, you add 2 beanbags, 3 beanbags, and 4 beanbags, and that means that you have to be aware of if your partner's going to catch or not, while they're trying to throw at the other couple, they're trying to receive, and it gets pretty messy towards the end of it. But you're talking about that 4-person empathy that has to happen for that to be able to be successful. And I thought about that because life was always coming at us like beanbags, but we're also attached to somebody else. In fact, we're attached to a lot more people than just one. And what we do affects everyone around us, whether it's a big thing or a small thing, whether it's a cognitive thing or an emotional thing, especially an emotional thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's you're in a relationship tied with someone else. And if you're going to move, you sort of have to be attuned. And I think that is part of what empathy is. It's how we attune to each other, sort of the mechanism of attuning, so we know where the other person is. So it's actually not just attuning, but almost like an integration of our brain or cells. I don't know if that resonates with you.
Well, do you remember when Harry Met Sally? And at the end of the movie, they got these old couples and they're finishing each other's sentences. Mm-hmm. They've been together so long, they're a cognitive, emotional being, as almost like the third entity is what I call it. You, me, and us. And that the usness or the we-ness of a relationship can be so strong and powerful that it's a powerful way to smooth out difficulties that couples have. And it's a wonderful way to connect to what I call that empathic level, that 4th level in a relationship.
Well, you said about how I define empathy, and sort of my work is, I would say, grounded in the the work of Carl Rogers, who did active listening, empathic listening, and a client therapist
Right.
process. But he was sort of expanding that into schools, into couples, into work environment, other into conflict mediation. So for me, the empathy, the sort of the core definition is sensing into the experience or the moment to moment experience of someone else. And that's sort of it seems to me it's sort of a sort of a foundational, process of how we do it. And that there's just different things that actually block that flow. And there's things like, judgment, that if we judge the person, we're kind of cutting off that flow. If we're doing the identification, as you're saying, like, oh, I had that experience, and I go off, I'm no longer present with you. I'm off in my own journey, or wanting to tell about my own journey. And so there's a whole series of sort of blocks. I think there was the other block you mentioned, sympathy. There's two different even definitions of sympathy. I think one is like, oh, you're telling me a story. And it's like, I feel so sorry for you. And it's that sense of feeling sorry. That's one sort of definition of sympathy that I've seen. And the other is sort of a state matching, like we both kind of go into the same, like, I'm really angry and you get really angry. And that actually kind of blocks me just being present with you in this sort of empathic presence of sensing into who you are. So, and there's a lot of other definition blocks that I'm seeing. So I don't know how that kind of resonates with you, that sort of model.
Well, it resonates beautifully with me, Edwin, but I also practice, and this is me, right? I'm definitely a bit of an odd duck, but I try to practice empathizing with things besides other humans. And I love fish, and so I'm often wondering what it would be like to be a little fish, or right, even a big one. There's plenty of evidence that animals outside of human beings empathize with us, with nature, and with each other all the time. Dogs are probably the easiest example. How would a dog know that someone's about to have a seizure, for example? Or how do we have service dogs that be so sensitive to what's about to happen in a human being? They can sense what's happening inside the human being before the human being can.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have the same capacity to sense what's about to happen in a dog? Well, I just don't think we practice it enough. I think if you start practicing that, I once watched a movie years ago with Matthew Broderick, and he was pretending to be a dog in this scene. And what he did is that he closed his eyes and he got down on his forehead and he sniffed along the carpet to see where his girlfriend had walked. And he wanted to see if he could do it, and he actually could. He realized that if I actually try to do that, if I try to conjure the essence of being this animal, maybe I can amplify this capacity. We know that when human beings lose certain senses, they can amplify other senses in its place. Typically sense of smell or hearing is common. But I try to practice all the time because I'm always trying to amplify my senses, because I'm trying to amplify my empathy.
So you're sort of expanding the empathy, that it's not just sensing into someone else's experience, but it's sensing into the experience of an animal, for example,
or a tree, or the wind, or the ocean, or other things that are they're just teaching us.
Yeah. So there's that. There's also the another aspect of the model that I use for empathy is self-empathy. So sensing into what's going on in myself. And I actually find that when someone listens to me empathically, I'm able to sense into my own experience to share more of that. So there is sort of this self-empathy going on when somebody empathizes, and that happens within the context of the empathy circle too. It's like some people will say, wow, I've heard so deeply, and it just has opened up more doors and more creativity by someone listening to me. So that's sort of that self-empathy, the empathy sensing into someone else, or I guess others, animals. And there is another quality of empathy that I see that is, I would call it imaginative empathy, that we can role play ourselves in any situations like an actor. Like I could sense into an ant, maybe how fast they're moving. I could sort of feel the energy that they're having, if they're slowly sort of struggling or if they're moving fast. So I'm sort of sensing into that, but I could also role play the ant, and like maybe your friend did, is the dog, where you're actually sensing into it, or like Meryl Streep, being Julia Child, or Thatcher, she just embodies the role, but she's sensing what is it like to be in this role. And so it does seem to me that that's another aspect of empathy, is this, that we can imagine ourselves. You add imagination into empathy, and then you sense what feelings arise for you in that situation. So, yeah.
Well, I differentiate actors from movie stars and method actors. And Meryl Streep is good because when she's doing her part, Meryl disappears. And you don't see her. She negates herself and becomes the character she's acting. And other actors, I won't name names, they never quite disappear. It's still a fabulous performance, but you never forget that that's the actor that's doing the performance of fill in the blank. And it's funny, I was thinking about ants as you just said the word ants. It's funny how that happens sometimes when our minds are obviously connecting properly. But what I think also with empathy, as you were talking about imaginative empathy, is I think about future empathy, which means imagining your future self and using that to help yourself in the moment, especially if you're feeling depressed, especially if you're feeling anxious, to build confidence. Because confidence really is imagining yourself in the future being successful. And if people use self-empathy and self-future empathy, they can actually start to practice and succeed at being more confident.
Yeah, I think we use that self-future empathy all the time. Like I'm working in the backyard on a fence, right? So, and I imagine myself working on that fence, getting the wood. What's the weather like? What are the challenges I'm going to have? And I sense it. I know, I can feel what the situation is. Is it going to be too wet? Oh, it's going to be uncomfortable. Oh, it's going to be dry. I'm going to need this tool, and I'm going to be struggling with this, but I can get this tool. So I sort of imagine myself in the future, working on that fence, and the whole scenario. And by doing it, I sort of practice that. And and I think we're doing that all the time. People are just imagining all the time this future self-empathy. Yeah.
I think that's fabulous. And I think that's how some athletes are very successful and some aren't so much, because they can imagine themselves succeeding in a particular action. And if they see it in their mind, they can reapproximate it in their behavior.
But these sort of definitions are different. Like that, I thought when I saw I would resonate a lot with how you're seeing it. I feel a lot of resonance, in our discussion. But there's these other definitions that are very popular out there. Is this affective empathy and cognitive empathy, which I think it's a way for academics to kill enthusiasm about empathy. Let's call it affective and cognitive. They're very dry, boring sort of words. And I'm just so that's a model that's out there, right? It's like, it's not even that model, that academic model is very confusing. So I'm just wondering what you think of that model of affective cognitive empathy.
Well, I mean, I think there actually is utility in breaking empathy down into various areas, in the same way that we can break a photograph or a painting down into colors and lines. And if I told you this painting is good because there's 4,780 brush strokes, and it's 5% green, it's 10% red, I could tell you all about it on a cognitive level, and you might say, that sounds amazing, but what does it look like? And what does it make you feel like to look at it? So when we break things down, we can have a very good cognitive appreciation of things, math. But when we look at it and we want to get meaning from it, we may have an emotional reaction, like poetry or literature. So I was good at math and lousy at literature when I was a kid. And I began to realize, wait a minute, it's just empathy. a good novel, a good novelist is a good empathetian, if you will, that they know how to make the reader feel things. And if you think about it, good novels are little packets of empathy. They're little capsules of empathy that when we read, we can start to imagine and feel and think and cry and laugh. When we're reading that novel, it's just words on a page. But what's happened is we've turned a cognitive event into an imaginative event, and then a cognitive and an emotional event as well. And that's the beauty of empathy, is it really is that it's the duality of those processes put together, and also many other things too. But I really think that there is some utility in separating it out, particularly if you're working with people who have alexithymia, which is an incapacity to be able to label or feel their own emotions. And I work with a lot of those people, and after a while, I'm using their cognition to get them to understand their feelings. And then after usually about 5 to 10 sessions, they're starting to say, I feel this and I'm feeling this, because I've basically taught them how to put words that can help them find those emotions in the same way that I've given them a code to find that book in the library that they didn't even know existed before.
Okay, so there I'm hearing you're seeing a value in sort of making nuanced distinctions between different experiences and naming those different types of experiences. Like we did talk about self-empathy, empathizing with someone else. We talked about imaginative empathy.
Yes.
So we are making these distinctions and these sort of nuances. And then there's this nuance of the emotional and the cognitive. And that's the thing I'm really struggling with, because I don't think it sort of comes from maybe a philosophical differentiation between affect, the cognitive and the emotional. And I'm not sure how accurate that is, or because that I think that the so-called cognitive has a felt experience to it. So when somebody's doing math, they're not in a cognitive state where they're not feeling anything. You cannot not feel, right? And people who do math, it's like, oh God, this is horrible. This is painful. So they have all this emotion tucked in, into it. My brain is hurting from trying to calculate this, whereas someone else might be really good at math. It's like, oh, this is fun. I just had a moment of creativity, and this is exciting, and a lot of curiosity about what's going to happen next. So I'm having trouble sort of seeing the difference between the emotional and the cognitive, that they seem to be so intertwined if there is sort of a differentiation. And I don't know if you can have cognition without a felt experience, it being a felt experience too. So I'm just wondering how you would kind of untangle that.
Well, it's quite, from my perspective, Edwin, it's quite easy to untangle that. Because what we're really talking about, again, the way I see it, I'm not trying to push this on you, but the way I see it is that what we're really talking about is intensity. And if someone has intense emotions, or if they have intense pain, it's much harder to get them to be empathic towards somebody else. And in fact, intense emotions and pain makes someone it makes them go into themselves. It makes them be much less likely to want to be empathic towards somebody else. So what I do in my office frequently, I work with a lot of couples in couple therapy, is if the intensity is getting a bit high, I'll stop the session right then and there and point out what they're doing. And it always works really wonderfully. You try and get the intensity down so you can get back to an emotional cognitive conversation. If the emotions get too high, you lose the cognition. Mm-hmm. And I kind of call it the toothache syndrome. If your toothache is really, really bad, it's really hard to pay attention to anything else.
Okay, so let's say that the couple, there's someone who's really angry. I'm like pissed off. I'm so angry at you. So you're seeing that as an emotion. That's a strong emotion. It's like that strong emotion, they can't even hear the other person. It's like, I don't know who you are. I don't care who you are. I'm just so angry and seething. Now, that is an emotion, right? You're saying that's an emotion. Where is the cognition? At what point do you see cognition kind of step into that?
Well, you'd have to get the person to calm down. You'd have to take some control. And if you ever saw me in a session, you might be a bit shocked how how controlling I can be if a couple are out of control. In other words, if I get frightened in a session, if I get scared when I'm working with somebody, that becomes my priority. And I imagine being those children around that couple fighting. Now I also have my own issues around couples fighting as a kid in a home growing up. So I'll let them know how I feel. I'm feeling scared right now with you being this way. And sometimes that has a quick dampening effect on the experience. And sometimes that's the first time someone's actually being able to take an emotion and just stop and then look at it from a little tiny bit of distance, with remembering how they were just a few seconds ago, and have almost a complete 180, bringing back to cognition on how that their partner and I might have been feeling in that moment. And to me, that's a powerful intervention. It works, again, about 80% of the time, not always. I've had plenty of people leave my office and slam the door, but come back later and have a chat about it. But I think what we're talking about is the intensity of emotion. I think emotion can always override cognition.
Okay, I'm going to keep pounding on this because I got to have some insight. I got to get, because I've been dealing with this and it just does not make sense to me, because I can sense the anger that someone might be having. I can see that. I can see that they might be sort of consumed by that anger and their whole body is just sort of filled in with that. And then in my case, I might, within an empathy circle, we reflect back, empathically reflect back, say, oh, I'm hearing you're really angry. Is that accurate? And then with that, they might sort of like take a pause and check, am I feeling angry? So they've created a little bit of space between themselves and that anger. And they're not like totally consumed with that one feeling. They have another feeling. They have sort of a, like, I'm checking, there's another feeling there. So it's almost like you're saying that cognition is having multiple feelings at the same times, or multiple states at the same time.
What I'm saying here, Edwin, to be clear with you, is that we want to start a state of reflective capacity. So the minute the minute they're not noticing themselves, like in a car, we have mirrors all around us. The minute you stop looking in your side mirrors and your rearview mirror, you're a danger. So what we were trying to do in a session, for example, if we're trying to get someone calmed down, we're getting them to look at themselves, look at yourself. What I sometimes do, I suggest to couples, if they're having a fight, go in the bathroom and have your fight in front of the mirror and look at each other. Look at your face. Would my partner want to make up with me if I've got a face that's looking like this? And look at my partner's face. Would they feel like I would want to make up with them if they had a face like that? And when they actually try that, it completely changes the tone of the conversation. I will never forget when I was a kid, and my mom was mad as heck at all of us because there were 5 of us, and she was British. She'd be yelling and screaming at us. This is like in the early 70s. And someone would phone the house, a friend of hers, and she would pick up the phone. Oh, hello, Julie. How are you doing? Yes. Her emotions would change completely. And I realized that emotions are temporary and they can change on a dime. And I find that it was hard to believe that, but I saw it so many times. And I began to realize in my practice, I could do the same thing. Again, not all the time, but I could prove to a couple that they could get out of a fight very, very, very quickly and get into a softer, sensitive, empathic place again, and truly begin to take in each other's experience that made them upset in the first place and soothe that, rather than sort out the fight with bullets and guns and fists kind of thing.
So if I'm hearing that, you're saying that cognition is sort of detaching from a felt experience, and you're in sort of another, you're looking at it from another point of view, and you're seeing it not sort of consumed by it, but that you're seeing it from I don't know, from a different standpoint or from another position.
From any other standpoint than being drowned by it. Yes.
I see. So as long as you're sort of seeing emotions, because from my experiences, like I kind of see the world as a 360-degree space, and it's like there's feelings all. It's like there's in different parts of my body, there's different feelings. Like sometimes I'll have like a anxiety, like, it's kind of localized here, but overall I feel sort of a spaciousness, or, I might have a little headache or a little stress in the head. So I sort of sense the overall space that I'm in. And when I'm with someone else, I sort of sense the space, between us, and sort of what I'm sort of sensing their space is. And, usually maybe having also maybe a feeling of curiosity. Who is this person? What's going on with them? How do we maybe create a sense of connection? Because that connection might feel nice, or curiosity, or maybe some creativity will sort of happen. So it's kind of this multi-dimensional space of feeling and experience that I sense. And, sometimes I can get angry and be totally enraged, I guess, or in tears where everything just falls apart and you're just like totally lost. So I guess that's just sort of describing how I see myself in that space. And I'm trying to identify the affect and the cognition, right? It's like, yeah. So I'm trying to put my finger on it. I want to get this really nailed down.
There's a great researcher named Daniel Stern who wrote a book called The Interpersonal World of the Infant. And so when we're first born, our cognitions, again, I don't remember being a baby myself, but our cognitions are much more rudimentary, but our emotions are fully there. So the first thing that we deal with the world and how the world deals with us is our emotions. And hopefully, and because we're born helpless, we have to have other people look after us when we're babies until we're quite old. If you think about it from the animal kingdom, how long it takes a baby giraffe to be independent versus a human being. And so the way that we're dealt with emotionally and the lessons we learn as a child have a profound impact on the belief of how our emotions and our needs and our wishes will be dealt with as we get older. And so what we actually see over time are defenses against how our emotions were either handled properly or how they were handled less than ideally. And especially if there's trauma involved as well. And that's why we can have such a range of people's empathic capacity if they've been, if they haven't had the perfect experience growing up in childhood. Because initially our emotions are the only way that we explain ourselves to the people around us. We don't have words yet until we're about at least a year of age. And so it's only our emotions, the emotive part of us, that is how we're interacting with. And then we grow up and those things just become layers and layers and layers on top of our inner child, if you will.
Well, there's the developmental model of empathy that as the baby, which I think you're sort of addressing, is, when you're born, you're just sort of feeling the whole world is one yes. big, and then I think that if somebody comes into the space and they're very anxious, that the baby sort of feels the anxiety, and it triggers its own tears, right? It's like, starts crying. I'm just feeling anxious because they're sort of feeling that. And then there's a time when they start, I think a year and a half, they start having a self-other differentiation. There's like some tests where can they sense that the other person is separate and sees the world from a different point of view. And I guess instead of calling that sort of a cognitive cognition, that's where I use the word imagination, that we can imagine ourselves in that other person's state, situation, and what does the world look like to them. And if you look at like Dan Batson, who I've interviewed too, if you're familiar with him, he did a lot of early studies on empathy, and he laid out 8 sort of definitions that academics have used for defining empathy, and 2 of them they're sort of under the cognitive empathy camp container, have been imagined using the word imagination. So it seems to me that it's actually cognitive is more associated with imagination than, I don't know, than some abstract something or other. I don't know if any of that makes any sense.
But it does, Edwin. When we're empathizing, we're trying to imagine the other person's experience from their point of view. We have to use our imagination. And this brings the conversation to a very difficult issue, and that is the capacity to empathize with an experience that somebody else has that you can't possibly have, or that you've never had. And there's a number of people who think you cannot empathize with another person's experience unless you've had it yourself. And I think that's sad that people think that, because we have to empathize with other people's experience. I mean, I'm a doctor. I had to tell people they had cancer when I was in my training. I don't have to have cancer to be able to empathize with somebody else who has it, in order to realize or empathize with what that person might be going through. And if I don't know what they're going through, I can always ask and help them with those feelings if I'm able to be both sympathetic and empathic with how they feel. But I think one of the biggest problems we have in psychiatric diagnosis comes to the issue of post-traumatic stress disorder, which the more I think about it, is in fact an empathy disorder. Mm-hmm. In the sense that if you have an experience that nobody else could possibly relate to, you might find yourself alienated by your culture because people cannot respond empathically to you because you have an experience. And this has happened through history with child abuse, the sexual assault of women, war trauma, where we had all these euphemisms for men and women coming back from war, because we couldn't relate to it. Oh my gosh, we can't relate to that. And I think the more I think about post-traumatic stress, and I've been working with this diagnosis for over 30 years, it actually is a disorder also of empathy, aside from the anxiety and the depression and flashbacks and all the cognitive stuff that begins to happen.
Yeah, well, that's one of the reasons I think I got interested in empathy, is that my parents were German in the eastern part of Germany during World War II.
Wow.
So when the Russians came through on my father's side, they hit him because he was just turning into his teens. And then, but the Russians killed everyone, and the soldiers killed everyone in his family. And then on my mother's side, sort of the same. It was different because there was a lot of women in the family, so there was like mass rapes. So that sort of that stress. I mean, I've sensed it, over time. And I thought, we really got to work at keeping this from happening again. And I do see empathy is, those wars are empathy deficits, and I can see how the trauma is like you didn't receive empathy. You experienced deeply unempathic situations, and the stress that comes. And it does seem that the empathy is sort of the healing mechanism to kind of reconnect people. So.
Absolutely, the healing mechanism to reconnect people to each other and to reconnect someone to themselves. Mm-hmm. Especially in PTSD from shame-based abuse, like childhood sexual trauma. And I've been doing this for 30 years, and it's amazing to watch someone come back to themselves and have that inner integration when for years they haven't been, because they've finally been able to empathize with parts of themselves and show sympathy and forgiveness for themselves.
What do you see as sort of the process for doing that? It's being able to share the experience and to have that experience be empathized with. So it's like the pain and the disconnection, for that to be seen and empathized with is kind of what it seems like to me, right? You have pain, disconnection, and when your disconnection is empathized with and it's seen, it creates a sense of connection, sort of heals the disconnection.
Yeah, I think there's that kind of confession aspect to it, where if you tell someone a story you've never told anyone ever, I think that's a powerful and potentially healing experience, particularly if the listener is trying to actively listen and is being empathic in the way they listen, and receives that story with sympathy and reflects it back with empathy, and encourages the person to deliver the whole story. And that's what I think I've really honed in my practice, is to get people to deliver their stories in a way that feels in an environment that's safe. And I don't know how many times people have come to my office with essentially the wrong diagnosis. And what's turned out is that they've had a story buried inside their soul for decades that they've never felt safe to tell anybody. But to go back to answer your question, yes, I think there's the experience of telling somebody else, but there's the witness of telling themselves in the presence of somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
Telling that story
Right.
to themselves in the presence of somebody else, I think is a very powerful healing part of it, because when they leave my office, that experience continues to ruminate in their mind in a positive way, that they did that, and they can begin to heal in between sessions. That healing continues to happen.
Yeah, well, there are so many benefits of empathy, and it seems to be the sort of the energy that kind of heals and connects. I guess maybe bring it back to the definitions. Where do you stand on kind of the state of the definition of empathy? Because I see so much confusion happening, and not only where do you see the situation, but how do we address it? Because you have this book Against Empathy by Paul Bloom, right? Okay, Yale, you got a Yale academic, says empathy's got all these problems, and everybody quotes. There's a lot of there's a lot of quotes now about what he says, and people just hear against empathy, it's bad, et cetera, et cetera. But at first I was kind of confused what he was talking about, and then when you really look at it, he was actually talking about sort of the sympathy that you're talking about, state matching. Like if your therapist is raging, that if you're with your therapist, you're raging angry, then your therapist becomes raging angry, and he's calling that empathy. And his whole book is sort of built on that has problems. I actually agree. And one of the main problems with what he's describing is it inhibits empathy. So it's a little kind of a crazy sort of a definition of empathy. His thing that he's criticizing, actually, I would see as a block to empathy, that emotional state matching or sympathy. So it seems like that I could go down the list of all the situations like that I see where it's so confusing.
Yeah, I've tried to engage some of those people and have conversations with them, and yet I have to have much success with that. But for me, empathy, what is the purpose of empathy? Well, I think the purpose of empathy is so that we can tribe up. Or so that we can do things in groups and we can sense the needs of others. Human beings, and I know that other creatures do this, but we have to rely on each other in case we're sick, or we're feeble, or we lose the use of a limb. So we have to, because we are essentially reliant on each other to look after each other. And after we die, we look after each other even after we continue. Our living being has stopped. So this is empathy. But I think the purpose of empathy is potentially to have a compassionate thought that can become an act of kindness. And I think what happens is that empathy is simply a state of feeling. You actually don't have to do anything about empathy if you don't want to. You can sense somebody else's feeling, you can recognize it, register it, and do nothing about it. When you start to contemplate what you might do about it, then that's feeling a sense of compassion. And once you actually start to do something about it, then that's kindness. So I think what we're talking about really is a lot of people talk about compassion fatigue. And that is if someone is empathic and then they feel a lot of compassion, I need to do something for that. And they do an act of kindness. There's a limit to how much you can do that. And I think that's why sometimes empathy by itself isn't necessarily, everyone has to be empathic, because I think there's actually a dimmer switch on empathy that we have in our caudate part of our brain. So they've done a study with dentists who have to be empathic with their patient when they're doing the history, but they have to turn down their empathy dial when they're going to be drilling and hurting this person. And if they can't do that, then they're going to have trouble doing that procedure. And when it's over, they can go back, they can turn that up again and be sensitive to the person in a compassionate way. So I think I kind of like that, because it means that being a therapist, I can't have my empathy button on full all the time. I won't make it through one day. I have to be able to control it so I can empathize, but at the same time, manage how drowned I get with that, and make sure I can be, first of all, useful to my clients, but then also not difficult with my family when I come home from work and have to expunge my soul from all that energy. And some of it's very negative.
Mhm.
So I think empathy by itself isn't necessarily the bad guy. It's what you do with it that might become problematic. And there is, I believe, in a condition called hyperempathy. And hyperempaths are people who kind of feel too much, and some of those actually people are not that much in tune with themselves, but much more in tune with the people around them. And there's certain personality conditions where that can be quite problematic. And working with those people is sometimes, it feels like they're actually in your skin because they're feeling your emotions almost before you are. And that's a very painful position to be in if you're feeling too much, if you have too much empathy and too much compassion as well. And the other final thing I'll probably talk about is empathy in psychopaths. Psychopaths are not people who lack empathy. Narcissists are. Psychopaths lack the capacity for remorse. And in fact, some psychopaths enjoy and can really enjoy the feeling that they're causing in somebody else. They're empathizing with it, but they don't care. They don't care in a sense of feeling bad for it. They might even luxuriate in some pain they're causing somebody else. So this is why I think it's important to have some clarity, especially if you're a therapist, on what you're doing, because empathy is something you can do something with, but you don't have to. And I think that's the trap that people think. If you have an empathic moment, you don't have to do something about it all the time.
Yeah, well, there's really a lot there. They put it. I would say
we're gonna have to do that next show, Edwin.
Yeah, we only got like about 5 minutes here, but maybe we can do another discussion about this. Maybe kind of go into that. I really enjoy, the discussion. I do have each of the things you're talking about. The empathy itself, I do think, is inherently constructive in the sense that if we put it into the relational, right? You're talking about sitting to somebody, you're empathizing with your clients, you're taking in everything. That is not mutual empathy. You have not been heard about, hey, I'm getting a little overwhelmed. I'm getting a bit stressed here with hearing all
That's
these
right.
negative thoughts. So they are not listening to you. And that's taking it out of that individualistic empathy and putting it into the relational. And I do think that that's part of the problem with therapy is it's not doing both sides of the empathy coin. It's not a relation. Maybe the therapist is there for emergency empathy, but the person who's coming actually needs to be learning how to listen to others and be building mutually empathic relationships. So I think that that's kind of missing from the therapeutic world.
Yeah, I'm not that kind of a therapist. I often talk about myself and talk about feelings, and sometimes I cry. Sometimes I cry during sessions. And I don't hide it. And if the person can see that I'm crying about something, I think they know that something's happening that's moving me. And if I have a huge event in my life, like if I lose a parent or something like that, I don't think it's such a bad thing for your client to know. I mean, heck, it's going to be in the newspaper anyway, or it's public information. We've forgotten the issue that we used to live in small tribes. Like we used to live in small communities. We would know everybody. And if you saw the local priest or the shaman, you would know that person's life. You would know their family. And this whole idea that therapists have to hide behind a kind of a veil of secrecy was really started off with Freud and his own anxiety of people being able to look at him and talk to him while they were speaking, because he was a bit shy and embarrassed. He was blushing during some of his patients. And so I think that whole idea of therapeutic absence and silence, I think, really came from something that happened in the 1800s, not today.
Yeah, need a new way of approaching it. I think that's what we do with the empathy circle, is try to make it this mutual. I think it's sort of a next step for for mutual support. I don't want to I probably have other appointments and so forth, so I could talk for hours, but I'm glad to, if you want to get together again, continue the dialogue. I am meeting with a couple of PhDs who in empathy, and we're working on this definition project. You can take a look at it. You're welcome to, chip in on that. I'll actually put this interview there too as part of that definition project. And yeah, it's been a lot of fun. When I saw the interview with you, I thought it'd be a lot of fun talking to you, and it has been definitely.
Well, I had a fabulous time talking to you, Edwin. I look forward to our next conversation.
Until then, Ashok, take care. Bye
Take
for
care.
now.
Thank you so much. Bye.